Hey, welcome back to Edgar Cayce Narratives. If you've ever woken up from a dream and needed a few seconds to remember where you are, this might feel familiar. You open your eyes, but something doesn't line up right away. The room looks normal, but it doesn't feel fully yours yet. Not because you're confused, but because something else felt more stable just a moment ago. In the dream, everything made sense without effort. You knew where you were, you knew how things worked, and you didn't question it. There was a kind of quiet consistency, like the world you were in had structure and rules you understood without thinking. Then you wake up, and that clarity drops. Now you're back in your real life, but it feels slightly less certain for a few seconds, like you're adjusting back into something less defined. And the strange part is not the dream itself, but how complete it felt. It didn't feel random, and it didn't feel like something your mind just threw together. So the question is simple, but hard to ignore. Why do some dreams feel more real than reality itself? Most people have had at least one dream that stayed with them longer than expected. Not just as a memory, but as a feeling that doesn't fully fade after waking up. It's not the kind of dream you forget within minutes, and it's not something random or chaotic, but something that feels organized, almost like it followed a structure you didn't consciously create. Some people describe dreams where they return to the same place more than once, and each time it feels familiar in a way that goes beyond recognition, like they already understand how that place works without needing to relearn it. Others talk about dreams where they are still themselves, but slightly different, as if they are stepping into a version of identity that already exists within that environment, instead of building it from scratch. There are also dreams that carry emotional weight in a consistent way, where the feelings don't reset every time you wake up, but instead seem to continue, as if the experience didn't fully end. You might wake up with a sense of loss, relief, or connection that doesn't match anything happening in your current life. Yet it feels real enough to affect how you think for hours, sometimes even days. What makes these experiences different is not just how vivid they are, but how stable they feel while they are happening. Most dreams are fragmented, inconsistent, and easy to question, but these feel complete, like they follow an internal logic that doesn't break while you're inside them. And it's important to be clear about this, because not every dream works this way. Most dreams are still random, symbolic, or disconnected, and they don't leave a lasting impression beyond a few images or emotions. But a small number of dreams stand out because they feel structured, continuous, and internally consistent in a way that is hard to dismiss as simple imagination. That difference is where this topic begins, because once you notice it, it becomes difficult to ignore. You start to realize that not all dreams behave the same way, and that some of them feel less like something you created and more like something you stepped into. If these dreams were just rare or random, they would be easy to ignore, but the pattern becomes clearer when you look at how they repeat and how consistent they are over time. People don't just have one of these experiences and move on. They often return to similar environments, similar roles, and similar emotional states. And each time it happens, it feels less like a coincidence and more like a system that follows its own internal rules. One of the most common patterns is recurring locations, where the dream takes place in a setting that feels familiar even if it doesn't exist in waking life. It might be a city, a building, or a landscape that you recognize immediately, and when you return to it in another dream, it hasn't reset or changed randomly, but instead feels like a place that continued existing even when you were not there. You don't need to relearn how to move through it, because you already know where things are, and that sense of spatial memory creates the feeling that this environment has continuity beyond a single dream. Another pattern is consistent identity, where you are not shifting between random roles or perspectives, but instead remain a stable version of yourself within that dream world. You might look slightly different or have a different background, but there is still a clear sense that you are someone with a defined position in that environment, and that identity does not need to be explained while the dream is happening. You don't question who you are in that moment, because it already feels established. And that stability is very different from typical dreams where identity can change without warning. Emotional continuity is another key factor, and it often goes unnoticed at first, because it feels natural while you're inside the dream. The emotions you experience are not random spikes or disconnected reactions, but instead follow a consistent tone that carries through the entire experience, and sometimes even across multiple dreams. You might feel connected to certain people, responsible for something, or affected by events that seem to have happened before. And those emotions don't disappear instantly when the scene changes, but instead remain stable as part of a larger ongoing experience. There is also a strong sense of memory within these dreams, but it works differently from waking memory, because you are remembering things that only exist inside that dream world. You might recall past events, relationships, or decisions that were never part of your waking life, yet they feel completely natural and unquestioned while you are experiencing them. It's not like recalling a real-life memory, but it still carries the same sense of familiarity and context, as if you are stepping into a timeline that already has history behind it. When you put these elements together, recurring locations, consistent identity, emotional continuity, and internal memory, a clear pattern starts to form. These dreams are not just vivid, they are structured, and they follow a kind of progression that makes them feel like more than isolated events. Each time you return, it can feel like you are continuing something rather than starting from zero. And that sense of continuation is what makes them stand out so strongly. This is where the difference becomes difficult to ignore, because most dreams do not behave this way. They are fragmented, inconsistent, and often collapse under any kind of attention. But these experiences hold together while you are inside them, and sometimes even after you wake up. The structure does not break easily, and the more you notice it, the harder it becomes to explain it as something completely random. At that point, the question shifts from whether these dreams are unusual to what kind of pattern they actually represent. Because once you see the consistency, it starts to feel like there is something behind it that is not immediately obvious. Up to this point, everything can still be explained as an unusual type of dream. But the real tension appears when you compare it directly to waking life, because that comparison doesn't behave the way we expect. We are taught from a very early age that waking life is stable and real, while dreams are temporary and unreliable. But these experiences start to blur that line in a way that is hard to ignore once you've felt it yourself. In waking life, things are supposed to be consistent, but in reality, our sense of stability often depends on constant confirmation, routines, and familiar cues that we repeat every day. If something small changes, like your environment, your schedule, or even your emotional state, that sense of certainty can weaken more quickly than we expect, and for brief moments, reality can feel less grounded than we assume it is. Now compare that to these dreams, where everything feels internally consistent without needing external confirmation, and where the environment, identity, and emotions all align in a way that does not require effort to maintain. While you are inside the dream, there is no hesitation, no need to question whether it is real, because it feels complete on its own terms. And that completeness creates a strange contrast when you wake up. This is where the contradiction becomes clear, because something that is supposed to be unreal can feel more coherent than something that is supposed to be real. And that reversal creates a kind of cognitive tension that is difficult to resolve. You don't lose your understanding of reality, but you start to notice that the feeling of realness is not as fixed as you once thought. The question then becomes more precise because it is no longer just about dreams being vivid or unusual, but about the nature of experience itself. What actually makes something feel real, and why does that feeling sometimes appear stronger in a place that we define as unreal? At the same time, there is another layer to this tension, because even after you recognize the difference, you cannot easily dismiss the experience. The memory of the dream does not behave like a random image or a fleeting thought, but instead stays structured in your mind, and sometimes it even feels more organized than certain waking memories that fade or become distorted over time. This creates a situation where two systems are running side by side, one that we trust by default, and one that we are taught to dismiss. Yet in certain moments, the one we dismiss appears to function with more internal consistency. And once you notice that, the original assumption that reality is always more stable than a dream becomes less certain than it first seemed. So the tension is not just about dreams, but about how we define reality in the first place. Because if something can feel real without being part of waking life, then the definition we rely on may not be as simple as we think. At this point, the question is no longer just about how dreams feel, but about how we interpret what is happening inside them. And this is where a different perspective becomes useful. Instead of treating all dreams as the same type of mental activity, Edgar Cayce approached them as experiences that can come from different layers of the mind, each with its own function and level of depth. In his readings, Cayce made a clear distinction that often gets overlooked, which is that not all dreams are symbolic, and not all of them are constructed in the same way. Some dreams act as a form of processing, where the mind organizes recent experiences, emotions, and unresolved thoughts. And these tend to be fragmented, shifting, and sometimes difficult to follow because they are not meant to create a stable environment, but to reorganize information. But alongside those, he described another category that behaves very differently, where the dream is not just representing something, but presenting an experience that feels complete on its own. In these cases, the dream is not simply translating waking life into symbols, but instead operates more like a space that you enter, where identity, memory, and environment already exist in a structured way before you become aware of them. This is where the idea becomes more specific, because Cayce did not treat these experiences as imagination in the usual sense, but as a form of access to deeper layers of memory that are not always available during waking life. He suggested that the mind does not only store information from the present, but may also contain patterns and impressions that extend beyond immediate experience, and that under certain conditions, those layers can become active in a way that feels like stepping into a different continuity. That does not mean every structured dream comes from this deeper level, and it is important to keep that distinction clear, because many dreams still function as internal processing, even when they feel vivid or emotionally intense. The key difference is not intensity, but coherence, because processing dreams tend to shift rapidly and lose consistency, while experiential dreams maintain structure, identity, and continuity without breaking under attention. From this perspective, the patterns we described earlier begin to make more sense, because recurring locations, stable identity, emotional continuity, and internal memory are not random features, but indicators of how the experience is functioning. If a dream behaves like a constructed sequence, it will feel unstable and symbolic. But if it behaves like an accessed environment, it will feel consistent and self-contained. This does not require you to accept any specific belief about where these experiences come from, but it does provide a different way to look at them without reducing everything to randomness. Instead of asking whether the dream is real or not, the focus shifts to how the experience is structured and what kind of process or access point it might represent within the mind. And once you start looking at dreams through that lens, the original contradiction changes form, because the question is no longer why an unreal experience feels real, but whether we are grouping different types of experiences under the same label without recognizing how different they actually are. If some dreams are constructed and others are accessed, then the feeling of realism may not be an illusion, but a signal of how the experience is being generated. This reframing does not solve the question completely, but it changes how we approach it. Because instead of dismissing the experience or trying to force it into a single explanation, it allows for the possibility that the mind operates on multiple levels, and that what we call a dream may not always be the same kind of event. Once you step back from a single experience and start looking across different people, the same types of dreams begin to show up with similar patterns, even when the details are completely different. This is what makes the topic harder to dismiss, because it is not limited to one person's interpretation, but appears in repeated forms that follow recognizable structures across many accounts. One of the most common categories is recurring dreams, where people return to the same environment over time, not as a repeated scene, but as a place that seems to continue existing between visits. These are not loops where the same event plays out again, but locations that feel stable, where new events can happen each time, and where the person already understands how to move through the space without relearning it. The sense of familiarity builds with each return, and that familiarity feels more like memory than imagination. Another category involves identity-based dreams, where the person is consistently a specific version of themselves within the dream world, and that identity does not reset or shift randomly from one experience to another. In these cases, the person may have a different role, background, or set of relationships, but those elements remain stable across multiple dreams, and there is a sense that this identity has its own continuity independent of waking life. The experience feels less like acting and more like stepping into a role that is already defined. There are also location-based dream systems, where people describe entire environments that expand over time, with different areas, structures, or regions that they gradually become familiar with. These are not isolated scenes, but connected spaces that feel mapped in a way that allows movement, exploration, and recognition. And each time the person returns, the environment retains its structure instead of resetting. That consistency creates the impression that the place exists beyond a single moment of imagination. When you compare these patterns to modern scientific explanations, you start to see both overlap and limitation. From a neuroscience perspective, dreams are often linked to REM sleep, where the brain is highly active and processes information, emotions, and memory fragments. And this can explain why dreams feel vivid or emotionally intense. It can also explain how the brain recombines elements of past experiences to create new scenarios, which can give the impression of structure even when the source material comes from waking life. Psychology adds another layer by suggesting that dreams help organize unresolved thoughts, reinforce emotional learning, and simulate possible situations, which can explain why certain themes repeat and why emotions feel consistent. It also accounts for why some dreams feel meaningful, because they connect to patterns that already exist in the subconscious, even if those patterns are not fully visible during waking life. But even with these explanations, there is still a gap when it comes to fully describing the level of continuity seen in some of these experiences, especially when people report returning to the same environments with increasing familiarity, or maintaining a consistent identity across separate dreams without conscious effort. The existing models explain how dreams are generated, but they do not always fully explain why certain dreams behave as if they are part of an ongoing system rather than isolated events. This does not mean that the scientific explanations are wrong, but it suggests that they may be describing part of the process rather than the entire picture. When you place them next to the idea that some dreams may function as accessed experiences rather than constructed ones, the patterns begin to align in a different way, where both perspectives describe different aspects of the same phenomenon. So instead of choosing one explanation over another, the more useful approach is to recognize that these patterns exist across multiple people, across different contexts, and across different ways of understanding the mind. And once you see that consistency, the question shifts again, because it is no longer about whether these dreams are unusual, but about what kind of system could produce the same structured experience in so many different cases. If we step away from any deeper interpretation for a moment and look at this through a modern psychological lens, a large part of these experiences can still be understood in a grounded and practical way. The human mind is constantly processing information, and a significant portion of that processing happens outside of conscious awareness, which means that what appears during dreams is often built from patterns that already exist below the surface. One of the most relevant ideas here is subconscious pattern repetition, where the brain reinforces familiar structures by replaying them in different forms. This can explain why certain environments feel stable, because the mind is reusing similar spatial frameworks, and why identity feels consistent, because the brain maintains a coherent sense of self even when the context changes. Instead of creating something completely new each time, the mind reorganizes existing elements into forms that feel continuous. Emotional memory also plays a major role, because the brain does not store experiences as isolated facts, but as networks of associations that include feelings, reactions, and context. When these networks become active during dreaming, they can generate experiences that feel emotionally real and internally consistent, even if the specific events never happened in waking life. This helps explain why some dreams feel more meaningful than others, because they are connected to deeper emotional patterns rather than surface-level impressions. Another important factor is how the brain simulates reality, because even in waking life, our sense of the world is not a direct recording, but a constructed experience based on sensory input and interpretation. During dreams, the same system is active, but without external input, which means the mind has more freedom to build environments that still follow internal logic. When that internal logic is strong enough, the experience can feel just as stable as waking life, at least while it is happening. There is also the role of unresolved experiences, where the mind continues to work through situations that have not been fully processed, and this can create recurring themes, familiar environments, or ongoing emotional states that appear across multiple dreams. In this case, continuity does not come from an external source, but from the persistence of internal patterns that have not yet been resolved or integrated. All of this shows that a large part of what we are describing can exist without needing any kind of unusual explanation, because the brain is capable of generating structured, consistent experiences on its own. However, this perspective also has limits, because while it explains how patterns can form and repeat, it does not always fully account for the level of coherence and continuity that some people report, especially when those experiences feel like they are progressing rather than repeating. So the psychological view helps ground the discussion and makes it more accessible, but it does not close the question completely, because there are still cases where the structure feels too stable or the continuity feels too specific to be easily explained as simple recombination of existing material. And that leaves us in a position where part of the experience is clearly understood, while another part remains open to interpretation. At that point, the goal is not to replace one explanation with another, but to recognize that multiple layers can exist at the same time, and that understanding the mind may require looking at both what is already explained and what still does not fully fit into those explanations. At this point, after looking at patterns, interpretations, and psychological explanations, a clearer idea begins to form, and it is simpler than it first appeared. Not all dreams are the same, and treating them as a single category creates confusion that makes the experience harder to understand. Some dreams are clearly constructed, built from memory fragments, emotions, and ongoing mental processing, and these tend to be unstable, symbolic, and inconsistent when you look at them closely. They shift quickly, they change without warning, and they do not maintain a clear sense of continuity, because their purpose is not to create a stable environment, but to reorganize information in a flexible way. But other dreams behave differently, and the difference is not just in how vivid they are, but in how they hold together while you are inside them. These are the experiences that feel structured, where identity remains stable, where locations feel familiar across time, and where emotions follow a consistent line instead of resetting with each scene. The key distinction is coherence, because these dreams do not fall apart under attention, and that stability changes how they are perceived. From this perspective, the question shifts again, because instead of asking whether a dream is real or unreal, the focus becomes how the experience is generated and what kind of process it represents. If something is constructed, it behaves one way, but if something feels accessed, it behaves differently, and that difference is not based on belief, but on observable patterns within the experience itself. This does not mean that every structured dream comes from a deeper source, and it does not require a fixed conclusion about what these experiences ultimately are. What it does suggest is that the feeling of realism may not be random, and that it may reflect the level of internal consistency within the experience rather than its origin. And this leads to a more grounded way of understanding the situation, because instead of trying to label the experience too quickly, you begin to notice how it behaves, how it repeats, and how it holds together over time. That approach does not remove uncertainty, but it makes the question more precise and easier to explore without forcing a single explanation. So the core insight is not that dreams are secretly real in the same way as waking life, but that the category of dream may include different types of experiences that operate on different levels of structure and continuity. And once you see that distinction clearly, the original confusion becomes easier to navigate, because you are no longer trying to explain everything with a single idea. At this point, the question is no longer just theoretical, because it connects directly to your own experience, whether you have noticed it clearly or not. You may have had a dream that felt familiar in a way you couldn't explain, or a place that seemed known to you even though you had never seen it before in waking life. Think about the last time a dream stayed with you longer than expected, not just as an image, but as a feeling that continued after you woke up. Did it feel random? Or did it feel like something that already had structure? Something that you stepped into rather than created in that moment? You might also notice whether certain environments, identities, or emotional tones have repeated over time, even if the details change from one dream to another. And if that pattern exists, the question becomes more specific, because it is no longer about dreams in general, but about why certain experiences return with the same kind of internal consistency. This is where the idea becomes personal, because you are no longer observing it from a distance, but recognizing it in your own memory. And once you see that pattern in your own experience, it becomes harder to dismiss it as something completely random or meaningless. So instead of trying to define the answer immediately, it may be more useful to look at the pattern itself and ask a simpler question. If some dreams feel like memories, even though they are not part of your waking life, then what exactly defines what is real? At this point, we are not trying to force a final answer, because the goal was never to prove what dreams are, but to understand how they behave and why some of them feel different from the rest. Once you see the patterns, the structure, and the consistency, the experience stops feeling random, and the question becomes more focused and more personal. If this topic made you think about your own dreams in a different way, take a moment to notice what patterns show up for you, because that is where the real insight starts. The more attention you give to how these experiences behave, the easier it becomes to separate what feels constructed from what feels consistent over time. If you found this useful, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Edgar Cayce Narratives so you don't miss the next one. And if you've had a dream that felt more real than it should, or if there's something in this video that still doesn't fully make sense, leave a comment and share your experience or your question. I read all of them, and they often shape what we explore next.